So I'll jump right into it. I wanted to have a presentation with fewer slides, and I spoke to some guys back at the office last night and figured out that there were some things that the young guys didn't know that I really want them to know. And then it occurred to me that lots of people here might have missed some of this older stuff. So I went back and changed my slides, and now I'm out of time again. Like the introduction said, I'm from Thinkst, and we build Canary. And there's really two reasons why I think this is worth mentioning. The one is, career-wise, I spent a lot of time, about a decade, on the offensive side of security, breaking into stuff, breaking into networks and applications. And then we've spent a fair amount of time doing defense, and now we have a product. And aside from probably making me a sellout, why this is interesting is just that I think we've got a broad experience in the industry, and I'm hoping to share some of this with you guys. So right off the bat, I'd like to say thanks. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming out early in the morning. For the most part, today's talk is a form of advice. Like, more than anything, it's advice that I'd give to younger guys joining our company, advice that I'd like to have had as a younger me, starting out in the industry. And if you're talking about advice, one of the things that you should probably keep in mind, do any of you remember the Sunscreen song? I think it'll show your age a little bit. But there was actually an editorial, there's an article written by someone about advice being wasted on the young, and Baz Luhrmann changed this into a song where he gave a whole bunch of trite advice. So he walked through the song, and he said stuff like, respect your elders, marry well, take care of your knees. But the important thing is, for this talk, he said, be patient with people giving you advice. For the most part, it's just a form of nostalgia. And so for that, again, I'd like to say thanks for giving me the opportunity to be all nostalgic. If you're doing any sort of engineering, you've probably bumped across DRY for don't repeat yourself. And I said I had a conversation with one of the guys at the office, and one of the things he told me is, man, lots of your talks have a very similar theme. And this is probably a nicer way of Michael saying, man, you actually repeat yourself a whole lot. And some of that's not an accident, right? Unless it's a technical talk, if it's one of these hand-wavy, keynote-y talks, I'm going to talk about stuff that we deeply believe in, and stuff that you deeply believe in probably doesn't change a whole lot over time. So today's talk is going to touch on 3 other talks that I've given, some not so recently. Just with a show of hands, how many of you have seen You and Your Research or read the paper? Okay, one person, 2 unafraid to raise their hands. So for the most part, this whole keynote is just a thing to make you go watch some of our older talks. And that's because at the end of the day, everybody wants to put their YouTube watch counts up. And so again, thanks a lot. But no, in seriousness, for the most part, some of these ideas we deeply believe in and deeply want to share, and so they'll at least rhyme with stuff that we've said. Most talks like this that we give, I start with one of my favorite quotes from Brian Snow. And again, if you've never watched Brian Snow talking, you should look for his talks. Brian Snow, Dan Geer, you'll almost always get smarter by spending some time listening to them. And Brian Snow gave this talk, and in it he basically points out that your cyber systems work only because people haven't aimed at you or taken you out yet. And one of the reasons I like bringing this quote up, A, because it's true, but B, because it points out what a sad position we're in currently. Like, we're spending millions and millions in this industry, and for the most part, we only survive when people are not aiming at us. And the moment they aim at us, our whole game collapses. But that's not the quote I'm going to focus on today. Today, I want to focus on this one, or part of this one. So Dan Geer has a quote where he says, information security is quite possibly the most intellectually challenging profession on the planet. And this makes most of us feel good, because if you're going to be working in a space, then you want to be working in a space with the smart people. But I'd like to follow that up with saying you're probably conning yourself if you think that this applies to what most of us are doing. And by this, I just mean that InfoSec can be really hard, and InfoSec does have really important problems that need working on. But for the most part, most of us are not working on the parts of the problem that are really hard or really need working on. Almost the core of what I'm trying to push for today is that more of us start doing this. Most of the problems we focus on are just not the ones that matter that much. And almost by definition, it's because in InfoSec, we're really, really prone to distraction. Okay, most of us, or lots of us from way back, got into InfoSec because there's a constant stream of new things. And now you see that a constant stream of new things is almost part of the problem, okay? Because it keeps distracting us and we keep moving on before we've solved anything significant. And ironically, considering I'm standing up on stage at a conference and telling you this, part of the problem is conference talks these days, okay? We've gotten into this thing where conference has almost become a type of performance art. And you've got some of us, guys like me, who spend all of their time going around talking at conferences and not really doing much anymore. And you've got young guys now who are being wasted. Like, I get relatively frequently pings from young guys saying, I want to be a conference speaker. And you almost want to tell them that being a conference speaker is not a thing. Like, that's not a thing you aspire to. Like say you want to solve a problem, or say you want to push this boundary. But wanting to be a speaker is, it's just not that worth aiming for. And I've actually given a whole talk, again, trying to boost my YouTube numbers, on what I think is wrong with security conference talks today. And the moment you say this, most people think you're going to complain about the problem of stunt hacking. And I don't think stunt hacking is our biggest problem. So stunt hacking is when people say you pick something new and niche, hack a toaster, go give a talk about hacking toasters. I actually think some good comes out of it, and sometimes that does push the ball forward. The bigger problem that I have with conferences is that we've started to make learning too passive. Okay, so you've got people who attend every Black Hat, attend every DEF CON, and if you ask them 3 months later what they've learned from it, there's almost nothing. Okay, it's almost like watching TED Talks, where it's becoming like empty calories or potato chips for your mind. So you go and you do these things, but you're not any better for it. In the end, you end up with a lot of people consuming a lot, but not producing a lot. And as hackers, that's the stuff we were supposed to try to avoid. And if we're talking about distractions, in the enterprise, there's a ton of them, right? Like way back, I gave this talk about why I thought pen testing was actively hurting the industry. And I realize that we are pen test heavy crowd. So I'm here all of today and some of tomorrow, and you guys can argue with me in private about why I think this. But for the most part, my theory is that we're doing a lot of work, we're doing a lot of stuff, but we're not significantly moving this needle forward. And there's two simple heuristics that I've been using for years on this. The one is honest question. If you pen tested an org or defend an org, the question is, do you really think that if I broke into your org, I wouldn't be able to move laterally like it's 2003? With a show of hands, anyone who has an org that thinks they're better than a 2003 level org for lateral movement? Nobody feeling brave this morning. And the second one is, if you've done a pen test in the last 2 years, or if you're defending a network, how many 0 days do you think I would need to actively get your organization's crown jewels? Okay, we see a count of 0 back there, which is more honest than most. And even if you're talking about really good companies and really good orgs, for the most part, most guys will give you an answer of 1. So for millions that we're spending and for millions of hours worldwide that we're investing, most people are 1 or 0 days away from the worst day of their life. And that's a shocking place to be in, okay? Because it means that for all the effort that we're putting in, what we're doing seems to be, again, to steal Dan Gear's words, making no therapeutic difference, okay? We engaged in lots of activity, but what are we actually getting for it? And again, it's interesting because most of us, or most of the people that I know, got into this field because of the challenge, okay? They liked the challenge of it. And what you find is that lots of us have ended up in positions now where we're comfortable, even if it's not that challenging anymore. Like, breaking into networks is hard for some definition of hard, but it's not like it's impossible anymore. You kind of know when you go out on a pen test that you're going to own them. I see lots of guys who are really into social engineering, lots of folks. And in honesty, when I ran a pen test company, we had to slow down on social engineering because it was so ridiculously successful. And all the young guys in the company just saw it as such an easy way to win. They'd start to do it on every engagement. And, well, what's the point of that? Again, if we came in because we liked challenging, that stuff's not challenging. It's just winning because we're playing against kids. You're taking candy from a baby on those engagements. And so one of the things that I really want to push for, if you got into this for the challenge, is that you should consider making a change and playing for the blue team instead of the red team. For one thing, I genuinely think that there's tons and tons of research fun to be had in the blue team. I think there's lots of goodness to be done. For those of you who have a strong entrepreneurial bent, I deeply believe that there's a bunch of products and companies waiting to be built to solve blue team problems that we've known about for 30 or 20 years. If you've tried to build a company doing red team stuff, you'll know that other red team companies are happy to use your free tools, maybe not so happy to pay for tools. There's a few companies who've actually managed to break through selling tools to pen testers, but for the most part, you're not going to sell it. Find a way to solve the local admin password problem on networks. People will line up to pay you for it. Find a way to solve two-factor authentication is something we've known about forever. Doug Song and John Oberheide are two of the smartest people you're likely to meet, and they've built a company solving the two-factor authentication problem. And for those of you who track the markets, Duo is now a unicorn, right? They're a billion-dollar valuation company that fundamentally solve two-factor authentication. There's tons of goodness in blue team work. You should consider it. But one of the challenges when you start talking about blue team work is the strange concept of utopia that we have, where and the utopia stuff breaks down into two things. The one is we expect our solutions to be perfect. And if they're not perfect, we throw them out. Okay, and it may sound trite, don't let perfect become the enemy of good, but we see this all the time. A few years ago, I did work with a company, and one of the first things I said to the company was, listen, you've got a problem, you've got IE6 in some spots, you've got old versions of Windows, let's make a plan and roll out Emmet, Microsoft's toolkit for corruption. And it turns out that this company has a really smart reverse engineer working for them who came back to tell me all the ways he could bypass Emmet, okay? And he's right. He's completely smart and he completely can bypass Emmet. But he's absolutely wrong because Emmet was absolutely the thing that that organization needed. Okay, it doesn't matter that reverse engineer 1 out of 1,000 can bypass it. The org needed it, and that's the solution that would have been best for them. We talk a lot about this in our talk on Bring Back the Honeypots, where you see lots of old solutions, and not just because we sell Canary, but if you go back to honeypots, there's a cool example. This one will really date you. Does anyone here remember Sebek, a product called Sebek, or a tool called Sebek? Okay, so in the early 2000s when honeypots were hot, guys like Lance Spitzner started the HoneyNet project. And there was a smart project called Sebek, which you installed on your Linux box or Solaris box, and it acted as a almost like rootkitting yourself, so that it would then send all of your captured traffic and keystrokes along to someone who can observe what's happening on the box. And so Sebek was published as here's a way to rootkit your box. And soon after that, at CanSec West, someone did a talk on how you can detect Sebek. Okay, and the answer was if you're on a box running Sebek and you do this complex timing of syscalls, you could tell that your OS was doing something that it shouldn't be doing. And that kind of killed Sebek, because under these extreme conditions in a lab, attackers could tell that Sebek was running. And that's stupid, okay? Because when you look at most of the attacks that are being carried out today, even high profile, highly effective attacks, your attacker is not timing syscalls when he gets on that box to tell if Sebek's running or not. He's grabbing all the docs he can from the network share and he's running. Okay, when Snowden was grabbing files from shares and SharePoints, he wasn't checking if the syscall timings were different or not. So the solution that was built 20 years ago that would have been helpful gets shelved because, hey, it can be stopped in the lab. And that's a silly place for us to be. And when we talk about utopia, something else that hurts blue teams a fair bit is the way we look at enterprise obstacles. For anyone who's doing pen testing, breaking into applications, exploit writing, you know you start off thinking, knowing that what you're doing shouldn't be done. Okay, so if you try to do X and your results are a little skewy, you know you need to work a little harder and make it unskewy. Okay, that's what you signed up for. But when you're working in blue teams, lots of people work with the opposite assumption. You have a tool and it gives you slightly bad results, and you go, this tool sucks, I must throw it out. You work with the tool and it gives you false positives, and you go, this is false positives, I'm going to get rid of it. They are broken. They are not perfect. You need to make it work anyway. And people keep talking about saying strange things. Like if you talk about defending your enterprise, you see people complaining about their users. And the users did this and the users did that. And so most defenders have this feeling that they could defend their organization if only these organizational challenges weren't there. And organizational challenges are why you have a job. Like bypassing those challenges is the challenge. And for people who manage to do it right, there's dual levels of success. We just have to realize those are the challenges. Let's look for them and let's aim for them. A few guys have been beating this drum. Rich Smith, who was working at Etsy at the time, points out that if your security engineers don't like hard problems and novel solutions, you've probably got the wrong security engineers. Okay, you need to be expecting those problems and working for them. And for the most part, I've summed this up as embracing the hack. And by this, I mean blue teams and defenders need to get more comfortable hacking stuff together rather than just buying solutions. I think there's goodness there. Again, it's something that I've spoken about at T2 last year. And if you want, yeah, there's a bunch of details in there with things that I think you should be considering. But for the most part, NullCon is a research con. And so what I do want to talk about and focus on is research. And this is some of the bits that I ended up adding last night, mainly because, with a show of hands, how many of you have read the paper You and Your Research? That's super interesting. So I'm really glad I did this. So if there's one paper that's absolutely influenced me more than any other in InfoSec, it's this one, You and Your Research. And if you take only one thing away from this talk, go and read this paper. There's actually a video of Hamming delivering this talk. Don't watch it. He writes better than he speaks. But read this paper. Like I make a point to read it multiple times a year, and it's life-changing. And what happened was I was speaking to two of the young guys at Thinkst, And both of them told me they hadn't heard of it or read it. And I find that so fundamentally unacceptable that it forced me to change my talk today. So if you haven't, Richard Hamming is a pretty famous mathematician. If you've done maths or physics, you've dealt with Hamming numbers, the Hamming equation, the Hamming window. And Hamming gave this talk where he addressed a bunch of people. And the whole talk was focused on how do you do great research. And there's a whole bunch of lessons in here that I think we can co-opt or steal. And he starts by defining it, saying, what is great research? How would you define it? And for him, he was talking about Nobel quality work or Fields Medal quality work. But I think it applies pretty easily to us. And he answers the question, how did he do the study? What made him do it? And the answer is, Hamming was one of those people who worked on the Manhattan Project. Okay, so he helped build the bomb. And he says, working on the Manhattan Project, he saw that he was just a stooge, right? He was brought in to fix the early computers. And so he points out that he worked with Feynman, and he worked with Fermi and Teller and Bethe, and he saw that he was not putting out the same quality work as them. And so he gets really interested in what makes someone a Feynman versus what makes someone a Hamming, or Hamming at that point. And this already leads us to a super great insight, right? Which is pretty old. It goes back to Socrates, which is the unexamined life is not worth living. Okay, and one of the things that you should be doing periodically is stopping, taking a checkpoint and asking yourself, is this what you signed up for? Like, you signed up for doing research, are you doing it? You signed up to move the ball forward, are you doing it? If you're not taking periodic checkpoints like that, you're probably doing yourself an injustice. Now, Hamming looked at other people and started measuring himself. And it's good for us because we've got a whole bunch of positive role models, right? For almost every stage of your life, if you're a student, if you married with kids, if you like Moxie and you live on a boat, or if you're a PhD like Charlie Miller, if you're living in Poland but think you can redefine the way OS security is done, we've got positive role models for almost everything. And one of the questions, although it's not normally good if you're raising children, I'm saying compare yourself to these other people and ask yourself, why are they able to do it and why not you? Why are they pulling off stuff that's fundamentally groundbreaking? Am I just a stooge? Like, why can't I do first-class work? And for this, Hamming says, look, drop false modesty and say to yourself, I want to do first-class work. Because one of the problems that most people have is that they consign first-class work to luck. Okay, so how did Dino find karma attacks? He got lucky. Like, he looked at it first and he got lucky. How did Charlie Miller hack the Jeep so early? He was lucky because of XXX. And for some of it, it's true. Like, Charlie had DARPA funding, and you probably don't have DARPA funding paying for a Jeep so that you can go and hack it. And Hamming talks about this too. He says, like, when you look at Einstein, what you notice is that he did get lucky, but you notice he does things consistently, okay? So all of it can't be luck. And he says, you see again and again from someone who's good, that they do good things, okay? You see more than one good thing from them. And if you look at Dino, for those of you who don't know Dino Daizovi, again, you should be listening to just about everything he says. But if you track Dino's timeline, you'll see way back he did early Spark exploitation. And then you'll see karma attacks were awesome, and they're still being actively exploited today. If you're running Metasploit with OS 10 exploit payloads, chances are it has its roots in something Dino wrote. And now he's doing container security. Okay, one guy, but you see a wealth of different topics, and he's done good stuff in all of them. And you look at other people, like you look at Mudge, and way back, Mudge wrote one of the first papers on overflows, like weeks apart from LF1 smashing the stack. He forms the Loft, which essentially becomes the template for most pen test security companies today. He goes into the government and he ends up doing things like cyber fast track, which spurns a whole bunch of other research. One guy consistently pushing the envelope, consistently doing coolness. And there's lots of examples of this. Recently, Michael Zalewski has started commenting about his life as a Google security manager. And again, a part of you feels like it's just obscene. Like he's made these great contributions technically. He's built passive vulnerability scanning way before it was cool. He was doing redress way before it was cool. Now he's a manager and is also a great manager. But again, it's kind of what Hamming said would happen, right? He says, if you have quality people doing quality stuff, sooner or later they do something great. It's certainly not luck. And if it's not luck, then we should be asking, what is the key characteristic? And Hamming answers it by saying it's independent thoughts and the courage to follow them. And the instant reaction to this is, wait, what about brains? Like what about just being smart? And Hamming says to that audience, he says, most of the people here are probably smart enough to do first-class work. But what you lack is independent thoughts and the courage to chase them. In his paper, he gives two examples of two guys who he talks about that were not intuitively super smart, but once they got the courage to go do good things, they did more and more great things. And he says that once you get the start, that's how it progresses. Two very nice examples of this. How many of you have looked at Corlan tutorials? Okay, so now there's a bunch of hands. How many of you know that Corlan, or Peter van Ekenoot, took his first exploit training under Saumil? Okay, so I know Saumil keynoted a few years ago. Saumil gave his exploit laboratory. You see Peter's early documentation, Corlan's early documentation, writing up Saumil's class exploits. He then starts doing tutorials against Bob's FTP server and Winamp player, whatever. And then he goes on to do really, really great things and make really nice contributions to the space once he gets his courage up. For those of you who know Johnny Long, I remember the first talk that Johnny gave at DEF CON on Google hacking. And literally, this guy showed up and he did an entire talk on Google queries. And at the time, there were people giggling. It was like, is this hacking? Like, you used Google, like, good for you. And Johnny's gone on to do really great stuff, even outside of InfoSec, right? If you followed his iHack charities, he's literally moved himself and his family, he's back now, to Uganda, where they're physically donating time and money to people in need. And so a question has to come up that says, is it then a question of age? Like, is this something you can do just when you're young? And Hamming had this question that said, look, Einstein came up with stuff early, and lots of people seem to do their best work when they're young. And it should scare us a little bit, certainly scares me as I get older. A few years ago, I think this was Dave Eitel, who was talking about the Lifetime Achievement Award. And he says that hackers' lives end at 30. He says by the time you turn 40, you should put down the dissembler and start considering a job in management. With respect to Dave Eitel, if you look for examples in InfoSec, you'll find across the spectrum, whatever age you're looking at, from way down when guys are in their teens cracking Sony PlayStations, way to the top as people hit their 80s, people making significant contributions to the space. So age shouldn't be the driver. Something that comes up a lot is people asking, well, what you probably need is more free time than I have. Like, you need a lot of free time. And again, it's something that Hamming himself addresses in his paper, where he says most people have the wrong idea of what optimum working conditions are to do great research. And now there's many people who'll point out that creativity needs constraints. Okay, so if you sit in a room and have all the time to think of whatever you want to think of, chances are you're not going to come up with anything great. And so what he says is, more than anything else, what you need is drive. Okay? And it sounds obvious and it sounds trite, but he quotes Newton, who says, if other people worked as hard as I did, they'd get similar results. And especially in InfoSec, it's important that we really understand this. Because most of the time we go to InfoSec conferences, you go to Black Hat and you go to DEF CON, and you see the security people who you look up to, and they at parties and they're drinking and they're enjoying themselves, and you seem to think that that's how they get those results. When in actual fact, that's like the 1 week they were let out of their rooms, and that's why they're behaving slightly insane, okay? Because the rest of the time they're working their tails off, okay, producing quality research like this. And there's good documentation on it now, right? As Malcolm Gladwell as it might be, his 10,000 hours concept is fairly well expressed and fairly well understood. And Hamming gives a beautiful example of this. He says he was working with a guy called John Tukey. I don't know how you pronounce that. And he says at some point, Tukey did something brilliant. And he says he went to his boss and said, like, this is ridiculous. Like, how can someone as young as Tukey know as much as Tukey does? And his boss said, you'd be surprised at how much you'd know if you worked as hard as he did, as often as he did. And essentially what his boss was pointing out is that knowledge and productivity work like compound interest. Okay? And simply what he was saying, the more you learn, the more you know, the more you know, the more you learn, the more you can do, the more opportunities you get to learn. Okay? And his boss's words are paraphrased. Given two people of approximately the same ability, one person works 10% more than the other, the latter will more than twice outproduce the former. Okay? Hard work consistently done seems to be a surprise to many people. And I first gave the talk on you and your research when in Belgium at BrewCon. And I had this quote up, which was Dino talking about Tavis. So by now, I'm guessing everyone knows Tavis Ormandy. Taviso works for Google. Tavis aims at a problem or aims at a segment, and he finds bugs almost seem to fall out of the tree. But what's interesting is, if you go to Tavis's homepage, okay, you'll see that Tavis has been doing bug auditing for years and years. Okay, he's been contributing to open source, fixing bugs forever. And in fact, it's a shame that you can't find this Crack Me anymore, or this write-up anymore. But there's a write-up that I used to like to share of Tavis talking about this Crack Me that he solved. And you see in his documentation, he talks about how he worked on it for weeks, didn't get a solution, put it away, came back a month later, found the solution. And at BrewCon, when I was giving this talk, I also saw this, okay? And it's hard to notice, but the guy here with the blue looks like he's at the conference and is watching How I Met Your Mother on his laptop, okay? And the main point that I have is not that I have anything against the series, but just that you get to make this decision every day, whether you aim to be Tavis or whether you aim to be How I Met Your Mother guy. It's your call. And this extends to almost everything, right? If you look, that's a really young Comex. That's a really young, does anyone recognize the guy on the left? Okay, that's GeoHot. If you look at the early videos of GeoHot hacking the PlayStation, he's obscenely young. He looks like a kid, okay? And at the time, Sony was going after him. But something that you have to honestly ask yourself is what you were doing when you were in your teens. Were you dedicating your entire holiday to a single electronics project, or were you doing a whole bunch of other things? And so I guess I'm asking, is it a little bit hard to do this? And my answer is, it's a lot hard, okay? It's not a little bit hard. And previously I said it's like why not all of us have the bodies we want. We know what it takes to have a good body, we're just not interested in putting that work in. Because again, it's just so much harder than it looks. It's not just passing on the one meal for a salad. It's just not something we do. So again, Hamming talks about the emotional commitment you need to make this happen. And in his paper and in his question, he's even honest about how that impacts your family life. And we'll touch on that. And so you have to ask yourself, did Hamming ever rest? Like if you read this paper, he sounds like a not fun guy. And again, he gives an answer for that, where he talks about what he used to do at lunchtime. And so he used to have lunch with the mathematicians and with the physicists. And at some point, all the great mathematicians and physicists left. And so he goes and he starts having lunch with the chemists. And when he has lunch with the chemists, he does what he used to always do. And he starts off by asking them, what are the important problems in your field? And straight after asking what are the important problems, he asks, well, what are you working on? Okay, and just those two questions should be enough to haunt you if it's something that you're honest with yourself and ask yourself often enough. And Hamming's conclusion was that on average, most scientists spend their time working on problems they don't think are that important. And they're not spending their time chasing things that are going to lead to important problems. And if you think about it like that, how do we expect a different solution? Like if we know what the hard problems of our times are, but it's not the stuff we're working on, like where do you think that goes? Hamming did something cool, which is just if there's an idea that you want to steal. He used to have something that he used to call Great Thoughts Time. And that sounds grandiose, but it's actually a cool idea, where one day a week, you can set whatever time you want. He'd stop and he'd just ask himself, where does this go? So back in his day, there was the start of computing, and he'd say, what's going to happen when everyone has computers? And he could predict by stuff like that, well, what's going to happen is we're not going to need rooms full of people to do this computation. And you can start to figure out what problems are going to come up. It's the sort of stuff that we should have been asking about IoT. It's the sort of stuff we should be asking about pervasive internet. You stop and you look and you say, what happens when everyone's got a phone directly connecting all of their personal stuff to everyone else on the planet? It puts you in a position to think of useful stuff. And so Hamming talks about being prepared. But in his preparation, he talks about the fact that great scientists, when an opportunity presents itself, they jump on it and they chase it. Something I talk a lot to the guys at our company about, because especially with younger guys, you'll see they come in, they get an attractive problem, and sometimes you'll see the guy going, well, okay, I'm off for the weekend, I'll pick this up on Monday. And I've got nothing against people having free time, but what Hamming was talking about is like almost the mark of great scientists is once they get that problem, they grab onto it with both hands and they sink their teeth into it. Because almost the worst thing that can happen is having someone else solve that problem before you can, because good problems are hard to find. And at this point, you should be saying, well, listen, this all sounds nice and it's a little bit highfalutin because Hamming was working on great research and actually I've got to go to a job where I've got to reset passwords every morning. Like my job just doesn't lend itself to that type of coolness. And even for this, Hamming says, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. And he gives an example of where he had to do some really what he considered trivial work. I think it was to maintain his sponsorship. But by attacking the problem differently, he ends up, I think at the time, coming up with the Hamming constant. And he says there's something interesting. He says you should do your work in such a fashion that people can build on top of it. People can say, yes, I've stood on their shoulders and gone further. And it's interesting, right? Because he's almost describing open source. And I'm not going to get closed source, open source zealotry here. But what should be interesting and what you should notice and take away is before H.D. Moore came out with the Metasploit project, there were hundreds of us all doing exploits from scratch every time. Copying shellcode, pasting shellcode. And then it took an H.D. Moore to say, we can do this better. We can build a framework and we could integrate this. And two things have happened. Today, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people use Metasploit, and he did well commercially off it with the Rapid 7 purchase. And again, it's why I'm saying all of the stuff is linked. It just depends on how you look at it. So a quick summary there. You need to work on important things. You need to deny that it's all luck. You need to start thinking great thoughts. And Hemming then says, well, if all of this is so cool, why do so many smart people fail so often? Why don't more people do this? The one we already discussed is the question of drive and commitment. And he talks about how important it is that you work hard at this. And during his Q&A, someone asks him, someone says, are you saying I can't have work-life balance? Like, are you saying I can't spend good quality time with my family? And he says, look, you've got to be honest. To do world-class stuff, Nobel-class stuff, you're going to be a little unfair to your family. You need to figure that out. And he says it tightly. He says, if you want to lead a nice, happy life with lots of recreation and all of that, go ahead. Live a nice life and get your recreation in. But don't also expect that you're going to pull off Nobel quality work while doing that, because it just doesn't work like that. The second thing that he talks about are personality defects. And the one that he raises that's, I mentioned before, is interesting for me, is ego assertion. Okay, and I say it's interesting for me because I always thought I don't have a huge ego. I think most people think they don't have a huge ego, which is part of the problem. But what he points out is he talks specifically about a person he used to work with who always dressed in jeans and a cowboy hat. And he says that this guy was a first-class guy, but when he went in to talk to people, it would take about 10 minutes for them to figure out that he's not a Yahoo and start giving him the attention he deserved. And he says, well, why go through that? Why force your ego on these people if you're going to talk to a crowd of people at Princeton, dress like the people in Princeton do, so you don't have to spend time with them wondering if you're a monkey or not. And yeah, it's interesting for us because almost all of us try to push our t-shirt and jeans culture. And sometimes you'll find you wasting time not getting through to the board just because they consider you hacker, tinkerer, and someone who's unable to talk at their level. He talks about the personality defect of self-delusion. Almost all great scientists touch on this at some point. And he says, you have so many possible alibis. When you look at that list of Dino and Helva and Charlie Miller and Joanna and Taviso, it's really easy to convince yourself that they had some breaks that you didn't. They had the opportunities. Much like you guys, I've got the, hey, I was in South Africa. And when Mudge was doing the loft, we didn't even have the internet. Like, I had to wait till university before I got the internet. But that stuff doesn't hold when you see sooner or later you bump into other guys who had the same challenges but managed to do awesome stuff. And we give ourselves these excuses because we don't want the alternative, that it just ends up on you. And what he says is, it's okay, just don't lie to yourself. Just know for yourself that you didn't do it because you weren't committed enough or weren't driven enough. And then he addresses the question, is this worth it? And he answers the question with absolutely. And the line that I like here is that the struggle to make something of yourself seems worthwhile in itself. Like, even if you're not achieving commercial success, much like the unexamined life not being worth living, it's almost why else are we here? Again, if you get a chance to catch any of Alan Kay's talks, you should. Alan Kay, this talk he gives on the future not needing to be incremental, talks about the work they did at Xerox PARC. Okay, and what's interesting is when he talks about Xerox PARC, he points out that they had 25 researchers over 5 years, and they invented personal computers, the GUI, Ethernet, WYSIWYG, a whole bunch of stuff from a really small group of researchers. Okay, so he estimates that by today's terms, they've generated about $30 trillion worth of money. Okay, and again, what's interesting is 25 researchers is nothing. We've got more researchers than that in this room. So Xerox PARC with 25 researchers gave us GUI, the Alto, the internet. We've got this whole room and we can't solve SQL injection and XSS yet. So in conclusion, there's a really interesting opportunity here. Right now, nobody owns the enterprise. Like, enterprise security is a wide open field. It's begging for research. It's begging for products. Guys like you have the knowledge and the skills to do interesting things in this space. But it is hard, okay? It's hard to build it right. And when it comes to ego, it's hard for you to build a product because one of the things that's really difficult is to go from being a pen tester who's always right, a consultant who's always right, to a guy who builds a product, and now you've got to sell to a customer who tells you that maybe the button should be blue and not red. And this keeps a lot of really smart people out of the product space. But we can't keep complaining about the state of things without actively throwing our hat into the ring and trying to fix it. So in summary, if you're a defender, let's try to make sure that the stuff that you're aiming at really matters. If you're an attacker, think about it, do some soul searching. I think there's a bunch of interesting hacks waiting for you in Team Blue. If you're a researcher, let's start working more on problems that matter. I'm not sure if we've got time for questions. We do. So that's all that I've got. We'll take some questions, and I'm at Haroon Meer if you want to tweet and tell me why I'm stupid. Thanks a lot for your time. So the question is, what problems am I working on? That almost sounds like a layup. So we've got Canary is something we focused pretty hard on. And essentially with Canary, what we're trying to do is build ways for orgs to detect that they compromised with as few false positives and as little effort as possible. It's an interesting question, not just so that I can try to sell our stuff, but part of the thing we're trying to focus on, and I think it's something that Duo did, and it's certainly something that gives us success, is figuring out that the hard problem was not building the product or building a product.
Right.
But the hard part is figuring out why products aren't getting adopted by enterprises. And so instead of saying, well, we built this clever thing and people are still not using it, part of the hack is figuring out what needs to be done to make it actually useful. But that's currently what we spend most of our time on.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Nope. Thank you very much.